In 1947, ancient scrolls were discovered in caves near the Dead Sea, nearly 1,000 manuscripts hidden for over 2,000 years. The discovery was immediately recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds in modern history. But what happened after that discovery is where the story stops feeling simple. For decades, access to large portions of the scrolls remained restricted. Translations were delayed. Important fragments stayed unpublished. Entire sections were studied by only a small circle of researchers, while the wider world was told to wait. And in 2026, when an AI system was given access to fragmented translations, archive notes, publication timelines, and linguistic patterns connected to the scrolls, it did not uncover one dramatic secret line that changed everything overnight. It uncovered something more disturbing. It found that the story people had been told about the Dead Sea Scrolls was too clean, too stable, too controlled, because the text did not point to one unified message. They pointed to conflict, fragmentation, hidden layers of interpretation, and a struggle over meaning that may have shaped far more than anyone wanted to admit. The original discovery sounded almost too cinematic to be real. A Bedouin shepherd, searching for a lost goat, threw a stone into a cave and heard the sound of pottery breaking. He climbed inside and found jars. Inside the jars were scrolls. At first, no one could have predicted how large the discovery would become, but over the following years, more caves were found, more manuscripts were recovered, and the scale of the archive kept growing. By the time the major phases of discovery were complete, the total number of manuscripts and fragments stood in the hundreds, then effectively in the thousands, if smaller pieces were counted individually. These were texts from the Second Temple period, preserved by the dry environment near the Dead Sea, and they included biblical manuscripts, sectarian rules, commentaries, liturgical texts, rewritten scripture, calendars, legal discussions, visionary writings, and documents that did not fit neatly into the standard categories scholars were used to. This alone should have changed everything, because until that moment, much of what scholars thought they knew about the religious world surrounding the rise of Christianity had been reconstructed from later texts, institutional traditions, and fragments preserved through histories written long after the fact. Suddenly there were primary materials, real voices, real documents, real language from a world that had previously been visible only through filtered accounts. And yet the broader public did not receive that world all at once. Instead, access became restricted almost immediately. A small editorial team gained disproportionate control over large portions of the material. Publication slowed to a crawl. Scholars outside the inner circle complained that the process was taking too long. Some defended the delays by pointing to the difficulty of reconstructing damaged fragments, the complexity of the languages involved, and the immense labor needed to identify, compare, and translate each piece accurately. Those explanations were partly true. The manuscripts were fragile and incomplete and scattered across multiple collections. But the slowness of publication still created suspicion. As years turned into decades, the delay became its own story. Why were so many texts still unavailable? Why were some fragments repeatedly referenced in private scholarship but not released in full? Why did the public image of the scrolls remain so narrow compared to the scale of what had actually been discovered? These questions only intensified because the Dead Sea Scrolls were never just archaeological objects. From the beginning, they sat near the fault line between religion, history, authority, and identity. If the scrolls contained texts from a Jewish sect existing in the same broad historical environment that produced early Christianity, then their implications were potentially enormous. Not because they would disprove religion in some simplistic way, but because they could reveal just how unstable, diverse, and contested the religious world of that period really was. Institutions do not like instability in foundational narratives. They prefer continuity. They prefer clarity. They prefer the appearance that doctrine emerged cleanly, not through conflict and fragmentation. That is one reason the delayed publication created so much controversy, because every year of silence amplified the sense that meaning itself was being managed. Over time, This produced two parallel worlds of interpretation. In one world, the scrolls were treated as a major but manageable archaeological discovery, important for biblical studies and ancient Judaism, but not fundamentally destabilizing. In the other world, the delays, restrictions, and fragmentary releases became evidence that something larger was being hidden. Most of the more extreme claims went too far, but the reason they spread at all was because the underlying situation invited them. If important texts remain inaccessible for decades, people assume there is a reason beyond mere caution. By the late 20th century, pressure became impossible to ignore. Leaks began to circulate. Photographs of fragments were used by outsiders to reconstruct texts without permission. Independent teams challenged the monopoly of the original editors. Eventually, broader access was forced open and publication accelerated. But by then, the damage had already been done, not to the scrolls themselves, but to trust. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls had become about more than the text. It had become about control over interpretation. That is where the AI analysis enters, because unlike a single scholar, an AI system can compare enormous quantities of text, metadata, translation choices, publication timing, thematic clusters, and lexical variation simultaneously. It does not feel pressure to preserve an established narrative. It does not care which interpretation is comfortable. It does not begin with doctrine. It begins with patterns. And when those patterns were mapped across the Dead Sea Scroll corpus and the history of its publication, a striking conclusion emerged. The scrolls do not support one neat story. They reveal a world of competing ideas, overlapping communities, disputed expectations, and unstable meanings. Some texts emphasize strict separation from the wider world. Others focus on hidden wisdom. Some are obsessed with purity and law. Others are visionary, symbolic, and apocalyptic. Some describe a coming figure in priestly terms. Others use royal or teacher-like language. Some imply multiple important agents rather than one singular messianic role. This matters because later religious systems tend to flatten complexity. They select, harmonize, define, and stabilize. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve a stage before that stabilization was complete. They show thought in motion. They show doctrine before doctrine becomes official. They show how much diversity existed before later authorities narrowed which interpretations would endure. And once that becomes visible, the question shifts. And it is no longer, what do the scrolls say? It becomes, how much of what later generations call truth was only one surviving branch of a much more chaotic world. Once the AI moved beyond the broad controversy over access and publication, it began analyzing the texts themselves at scale. This is where the picture became even stranger, not because the manuscripts revealed one shocking sentence, but because they revealed a pattern of instability across the whole corpus. Linguistically, thematically, and structurally, the scrolls do not behave like a single archive assembled around one coherent belief system. They behave like the remains of a fragmented intellectual landscape. Certain terms recur across different documents, but with different meanings or different emphases. Says, certain symbolic phrases appear in legal contexts in one text, visionary contexts in another, and communal identity statements in another. A human scholar can notice some of this through close reading, but AI can map recurrence patterns across the whole data set and detect when a phrase is not merely reused but conceptually transformed. That matters because it shows that ideas were moving between communities, being adapted, and being reframed. One of the clearest examples involve concepts often translated into modern categories like light, truth, spirit, knowledge, and covenant. In popular or devotional retellings, these words are often treated as stable and familiar, as if ancient people meant by them exactly what later traditions meant. But when the AI compared usage across texts, the semantic field widened dramatically. J's light in one document functioned morally, in another cosmologically, in another communally, as a marker of identity over against outsiders. Knowledge was not simply information. In some texts, it appeared as disciplined interpretation of law. In others, as revealed understanding accessible only to the initiated. In others still, it shaded towards something visionary or apocalyptic, an insight into hidden order rather than public teaching. These distinctions matter because they undermine the later habit of reading the earlier period as though it were already settled. It wasn't. The scrolls preserved multiple interpretive universes operating side by side. The AI also identified repeated structures suggesting hierarchy of access. This was one of the most important findings because it cuts directly into how communities manage truth. That many texts imply that not everyone receives the same level of understanding. There are outer teachings and inner teachings, public obligations and deeper interpretations, ordinary members and advanced members, texts for the community, and knowledge reserved for leadership or the initiated. This is not unique to one manuscript or one cave. It appears often enough to suggest a broader cultural pattern, and once you recognize that, another possibility appears. The public-facing versions of belief may always have been simplified versions of more complex internal systems. If that is true, then the later stabilization of doctrine may not have invented the distinction between public and inner meaning, but inherited and intensified it. That does not prove a hidden code or secret technology or any of the sensational claims people like to make. But it does prove that the ancient world surrounding these texts was not flat. It had layers. It managed access. It distinguished between what could be said openly and what was understood more deeply inside the group. The AI then mapped messianic language across the corpus. And here again, the results resisted simplification. Later readers often look backward expecting to find a single clear anticipation of a later religious figure. But the scrolls do not cooperate with that expectation. Some texts seem to expect priestly restoration. Others suggest royal leadership. Some imply multiple anointed figures. Others center a teacher, interpreter, or righteous guide rather than a conquering savior. This diversity matters because it reveals how later traditions may have narrowed earlier possibilities into singular definitions. In other words, that the religious future was still open in these texts. It had not yet been fixed, and that is exactly the kind of instability institutional narratives prefer to hide, not by inventing falsehoods necessarily, but by emphasizing continuity over conflict, certainty over plurality. Another major area the AI highlighted was apocalyptic expectation. The popular imagination often treats apocalyptic texts as fringe exaggerations, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they are central to communal identity. Time is divided into ages. History moves toward confrontation. Cosmic and moral conflict are linked. The community sees itself as living near decisive turning points. This is not marginal background material. It is a structuring worldview. And when compared with later religious literature, the AI found not exact matches, but a shared logic of expectation, one that suggests continuity of apocalyptic imagination across traditions, even where doctrines differ. That is significant because it means later systems may have inherited not fixed content, but emotional and intellectual architecture, the sense of hidden history, imminent transformation, purified community, revealed truth, and final vindication. What changed was not the existence of those patterns, but how they were institutionalized. The AI also examined publication history in relation to thematic sensitivity. Here, the results were not proof of suppression in the dramatic sense, but they were suggestive. Texts most likely to reinforce already accepted scholarly or religious categories tended to move more smoothly into publication. Texts that complicated neat categories, that challenged assumptions about unity, or demanded more interpretive caution often remained trapped longer in specialist handling or circulated only in fragmentary form. That does not automatically imply malicious concealment. Institutions slow down around instability for many reasons, but the effect is the same. Complexity arrives late. Simplicity arrives first. And once simplicity enters the public imagination, later complexity looks like controversy rather than correction. This may be the deepest thing the AI exposed. Not that there was one hidden truth buried in the scrolls, but that the process of releasing and interpreting them rewarded stability over reality. The reality was messier. Ancient communities argued with one another. They reinterpreted inherited language. They structured knowledge in layers. They expected different futures. They used similar terms in different ways. They did not yet inhabit the clean theological map later generations would draw. This matters enormously because it means early religious history cannot honestly be told as a straight line. It must be told as a struggle over meaning. And struggles over meaning are uncomfortable because they undermine the authority of final forms. Once the AI made that visible, the question changed again. It was no longer just what do these texts say? It became how much of later certainty depends on forgetting how uncertain things were in the beginning. By the time the AI completed its full analysis, the result was not one hidden gospel, one missing page, or one dramatic contradiction that instantly collapses 2,000 years of religious history. The result was something more powerful and much harder to dismiss. It showed that the world reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls was radically unstable, intellectually layered, and full of competing claims to truth. It showed that the religious environment from which later dominant traditions emerged was not a single stream, but a floodplain of rival interpretations, shared symbols, communal experiments, and controlled access to knowledge. And that changes everything, because institutions survive by narrating their origins as more coherent than they really were. They tell stories of continuity. They minimize contingency. They present the final form as though it were always latent, always destined, always central. The scrolls destabilize that instinct. Yet they force the admission that what later generations called orthodoxy came from a much more fragmented field. AI made this visible not by inventing new content, but by exposing relationships across content at a scale no human reading project had managed before. It showed that key concepts, often thought of as singular, were distributed across many textual worlds. It showed that some documents preserve legal rigor, while others preserve symbolic cosmology, and others preserve communal identity under persecution. It showed that hidden knowledge was not fantasy, but a recurring structural feature in how groups imagined authority. It showed that expectation, revelation, discipline, purification, and final judgment were already moving through multiple forms before later systems made them stable. This is why the terrifying part is not a secret weapon or a Vatican vault or a single erased doctrine. The terrifying part is that our strongest historical certainties often depend on how much early complexity has been filtered out. Once you see that mechanism, it becomes hard to stop seeing it everywhere, because it is not unique to religion. It is how institutions handle unstable beginnings in general. First there is diversity, then there is conflict, then there is selection, then there is canon, then there is memory, pretending the canon was always inevitable. The Dead Sea Scrolls interrupt that last step. They preserve evidence of the stage before inevitability. They preserve a world where ideas had not yet been forced into one final shape. And that means the AI's real discovery was not hidden theology. It was historical process. It exposed how doctrines become solid not because they begin that way, but because they survive enough rounds of conflict, editing, preservation, exclusion, and repetition to appear natural. That realization is far more destabilizing than any one sensational claim could be, because it doesn't depend on proving an impossible conspiracy. It depends on patterns in the evidence. The scrolls do not need to disprove later religion to transform how we understand it. They only need to show that the road to later certainty passed through much more ambiguity than official histories usually admit. The AI also surfaced something else that matters. Delayed publication did not merely slow scholarship. It shaped the emotional environment in which the scrolls were received. By the time many texts became broadly accessible, their simplified narratives had already hardened in the public mind. That means the public did not receive the corpus as a living complexity. It received fragments through interpretive filters already in place. This is how knowledge gets domesticated, not necessarily through open censorship, but through timing, emphasis, and the order in which complexity is allowed to arrive. First, the manageable texts, then the complicated ones. First, the materials that fit known frameworks, then the ones that destabilize them. By then, most people are no longer listening carefully. They have already filed the story away. That is another reason AI matters here. It doesn't inherit patience only for the approved order of revelation. It can compare everything at once. It can detect the asymmetry between what was released early and what remained interpretively difficult. It can reveal not a secret document, but a secret of process. The process itself favored order over disruption. And once that becomes clear, the Dead Sea Scrolls become more than ancient manuscripts. They become a case study in how civilizations control the transition from discovery to meaning. That may be why this story feels so modern. We like to imagine the problem is always hidden information, but often the deeper problem is controlled framing. The raw material exists. The issue is how it is arranged, interpreted, delayed, softened, and made safe. The AI did not break into heaven and steal forbidden truth. It simply processed the evidence without caring which version was comfortable. And the evidence suggests something difficult to deny. The earliest layers of the religious world reflected in the scrolls were more plural, more contested, and more structurally secretive than later narratives like to admit. That does not mean everything later is false. It means later certainty was built on earlier instability. It means history is less like a straight chain and more like a narrowing funnel. Many things enter, few things emerge. The few that emerge then explain themselves as destiny. The Dead Sea Scrolls remind us that they were once only contenders. That is why this discovery still matters, nearly 80 years after the caves were first opened, not because it handed the modern world one forbidden sentence, but because it gave us a way to see what institutions prefer to smooth over: the violence of selection, the politics of preservation, and the uncomfortable truth that what survives is not always what was most original or most true, but often what was most effectively stabilized. And once that idea enters the mind, the whole landscape changes. You stop asking only what was found in the caves. You start asking what every later institution needed those caves not to mean.